A black man in a sharp suit was walking to work when a police officer stopped him, questioning why he was in the area. But just as the situation escalated, the man calmly revealed his identity, with a badge bearing the presidential seal. What followed stunned everyone. Before we begin this powerful story, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts or any similar experience you've had. This space is for listening, learning, and growing together. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now, let's get into the story that had the whole nation watching. It was just after 7:30 a.m. when the sleek black sedan came to a smooth stop at the curb on Pennsylvania Avenue, not far from the Capitol. The morning air was cool and quiet, the kind of early stillness that exists just before the city bursts fully into motion. A tall, sharply dressed black man stepped out of the vehicle. His suit was impeccably tailored, the kind of navy blue that shimmered subtly in the sunlight. Polished leather shoes hit the pavement with purpose, and a black briefcase swung gently at his side. His steps were measured, his gaze forward, calm, focused. His name was Elijah Brooks, though few people on that street knew it. To most, he looked like any high-powered professional in Washington, D.C., and that was the idea. He moved with confidence, though not arrogance, the type of man who didn't need to announce his presence for it to be noticed. But someone had noticed. A white police officer sitting in a parked cruiser across the street, sipping lukewarm coffee from a stained paper cup and watching the man with narrowing eyes. There was something about the way Elijah walked, the way he held himself, that triggered something in the officer. It wasn't that he recognized him. It was that he didn't. And in his mind, that made Elijah suspicious. The officer, whose name was Nolan, had been on the force nearly 15 years, long enough to have grown cynical but not yet wise. He didn't like things that didn't fit, and Elijah, black, polished, and silent, didn't fit his narrative of who should be strolling down this particular stretch of city sidewalk with that much self-assurance. Elijah, for his part, felt the officer's gaze long before he reached the intersection. He knew that feeling well. It had followed him through airports, shopping malls, elevators, and boardrooms. He had grown up with it, learned to carry it like a weight that would never leave his shoulders. He didn't quicken his pace, didn't change his expression. He simply kept walking, his eyes on the glass and concrete building that lay just ahead. Nolan started his engine and slowly pulled out from the curb, his gaze never leaving Elijah. He radioed in a vague code that meant nothing urgent but gave him leeway to act. Then he got out of the car and called out, "Excuse me, sir. Can I have a moment of your time?" Elijah turned, his face composed but unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Just wondering what your business is around here," Nolan said, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "You headed somewhere in particular?" Elijah offered a polite but vague response. "I have a morning meeting," he said, not offering more. Nolan frowned. "What kind of meeting? Who with?" Elijah met his gaze. "Is there a reason you're asking me that?" The tension was immediate, like static in the air before a storm. Pedestrians had begun to notice. A woman slowed her walk. A man across the street paused at the corner. The city had seen this story unfold too many times before. Nolan took a step closer, his voice tightening. "You seem to be dodging my question. I'm going to need to see some ID." Elijah didn't move. "Am I being detained?" he asked quietly. The officer didn't answer directly. "Look, I asked you something simple. Now you either comply or I'll have to assume you're resisting." Elijah exhaled slowly. "Officer," he said, "I assure you, you don't want to go down that road today." That sentence, that single sentence, hit Nolan like a challenge and his temper flared. "You threatening me?" he said, voice raised. A few more people stopped to watch. Phones began to lift. Cameras began to roll. Silent but powerful witnesses to something all too familiar. Elijah stayed where he was, his expression still calm. "I'm simply telling you the truth," he said. "This will not go the way you think." But Nolan wasn't listening. He saw a black man in a suit and assumed defiance. He saw confidence and mistook it for arrogance. And most of all, he saw a threat where there was none. He stepped even closer, now visibly tense, hand near his radio. "You give me that ID right now," he barked, "or I'm taking you in." Elijah reached slowly for his inside pocket, pausing deliberately. "May I make a call?" he asked. "No calls," Nolan snapped. "Hand over your identification." There was a silence, heavy and long. Elijah looked at the crowd, then back at Nolan. He gave a slow nod, not of agreement but of decision. "Then I strongly advise," he said, "that you prepare for what happens next." Nolan scoffed. "Yeah? What's next?" Elijah reached again into his pocket, this time pulling out a sleek black phone. He pressed one button, lifted it to his ear, and said, "This is Brooks. I'm being delayed at the perimeter. Can you confirm with the gate?" Nolan's face twisted with confusion. "What gate?" he asked, more to himself than anyone. But before anyone could respond, the low hum of a black SUV's engine began echoing off the nearby buildings as it turned the corner, fast and direct, heading straight toward them. The moment the black SUV came to a halt, the air on that sidewalk changed. It wasn't just the way the engine purred with precision or how the vehicle seemed to glide rather than drive. It was the unmistakable aura of authority that accompanied it. The windows were tinted so dark they gave away nothing, like the secrets of the city it rolled through. Officer Nolan turned halfway toward it, distracted, confused, but not yet alarmed. He still didn't know who Elijah was. He didn't yet understand what that phone call meant or why the man he had just barked at with thinly veiled contempt hadn't flinched, hadn't begged, hadn't even raised his voice. The SUV's doors remained shut for a beat too long, creating a tension that made the gathered onlookers hold their breath. Then, simultaneously, the front and rear passenger doors opened. Out stepped two men in dark suits, not dressed like police, not dressed like security guards. These men carried themselves with the stillness of trained eyes and the precision of military instinct. One of them scanned the crowd quickly, a calculated sweep. The other made a straight line for Elijah. "Mr. Brooks?" he said in a level tone that betrayed neither urgency nor fear. "Are you all right?" And with that one question, Officer Nolan's world tilted on its axis. He blinked once, twice, not sure he'd heard correctly. "Wait, you know him?" he asked, but no one answered him. Elijah nodded calmly to the agent and said, "This officer detained me without cause. I'd like that noted." The first agent looked at Nolan and asked, "Is there a problem here, officer?" But the way he said problem didn't suggest a concern for protocol. It suggested that something was already wrong. Nolan stammered, I was just doing a routine check. He wouldn't show me his ID. He looked. He didn't finish the sentence. The words out of place died on his tongue, because in that moment, standing between two federal agents, Elijah didn't look out of place at all. He looked exactly where he belonged. "Your badge number, please," the agent said flatly, already pulling out a phone. Nolan fumbled for his notepad, reading it off with a dry mouth. The agent typed it in without looking up. Elijah didn't say another word. He simply moved past Nolan as the second agent opened the SUV's door for him. Before getting in, Elijah turned slightly and looked at Nolan. Not with hatred, not with rage, but with the tired expression of a man who had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. It was the kind of look that didn't need to say, "You made a mistake," because the weight of the mistake was already falling. Nolan, now visibly pale, tried to speak again, but no words came. The people around them were still filming, still whispering, some shaking their heads, others watching in stunned silence. The SUV door closed with a quiet thump, and just like that, Elijah was gone. But what he left behind wasn't silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes after something irreversible. Inside the SUV, Elijah exhaled slowly, loosening his shoulders just a bit. One of the agents handed him a small bottle of water, which he declined with a nod. "You good?" the agent asked, and Elijah replied, "I'm fine. I've been through worse." The agent nodded, not pressing. They rode in silence for a moment as the city rushed by their windows. Then Elijah glanced down at his briefcase resting on the seat beside him. The leather shined under the morning light, and embossed into its center, so subtly it almost looked accidental, was a seal. The seal. The one that would explain everything to anyone who understood what it meant. The presidential seal. But Elijah never used it as a shield. He never waved it around for validation or power. It was there only because it needed to be. But he'd long understood that no emblem, no matter how sacred, could stop certain people from seeing him first as black and only later, maybe seeing the rest. He wasn't angry, not in the explosive way people expected. His anger had long since cooled into something else, something deeper, a disappointment that could not be soothed with apologies or punishment. It was the quiet pain of knowing that no matter how far he rose, someone would always try to drag him back to the ground. Back on the sidewalk, Nolan stood frozen. One of the bystanders, a middle-aged black man in a postal service uniform, shook his head and muttered just loud enough for Nolan to hear, "You messed with the wrong brother today." Another said, "That's a damn shame," before walking off. Nolan looked around and saw only judgment. Not just from strangers, but from within himself. It hit him harder than he expected. He had no idea who Elijah Brooks really was, but whoever he was, Nolan now knew he had not only disrespected someone with power, he had disrespected someone with dignity. And that somehow felt worse. The patrol car felt farther away than it really was as he walked slowly back to it, his steps heavier than before. As the SUV disappeared into traffic, Elijah turned his gaze out the window. His meeting would still happen. His briefing would still be delivered. But something had shifted. The morning had changed shape. He thought of his mother, who used to tell him, "No matter how high you go, always remember the ground beneath your feet." He hadn't forgotten. But some days the ground tried to remind him anyway. And today it reminded him loud and clear. The echoes of the confrontation still lingered as the black SUV faded into the traffic like a shadow disappearing into daylight. But Officer Nolan wasn't fading so easily. He stood stiffly by his patrol car, hands trembling slightly, eyes darting between the retreating vehicle and the disapproving faces around him. His jaw clenched as he tried to make sense of what had just unfolded, of how quickly control had slipped from his hands. He wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not by someone like Elijah. Someone who didn't raise his voice, didn't fight back, didn't offer the usual resistance that officers like Nolan were trained to expect. It was that calm, composed defiance that cut the deepest. That was what made him feel, for the first time in a long while, like the badge on his chest didn't mean what he thought it did. His radio crackled to life, but Nolan didn't respond. He was still reeling, still seeing that golden seal in his mind, still hearing Elijah's voice, measured, powerful, and above all, unbothered. A few hours earlier, Nolan had begun his shift like any other, coffee in hand, complaints about traffic, grievances about paperwork. But now, he was standing under a different kind of pressure, the kind that didn't come from supervisors or the chain of command, but from the cold reality that he might have made a very public mistake. Still, pride is a stubborn thing, and even when a man's gut tells him he's wrong, his pride can convince him to double down. So Nolan got into his cruiser, slammed the door harder than he needed to, and gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He didn't say a word to dispatch. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Instead, he drove aimlessly for blocks, trying to shake the feeling that had settled in his chest like a weight pressing deeper with each breath. The truth was uncomfortable, and he wasn't ready to sit with it. Meanwhile, Elijah sat quietly in the back of the vehicle, his eyes half closed as the familiar landmarks of Washington passed by outside. His mind wasn't on the briefing he was about to deliver or the policy implications it held. No, it was on that brief moment of being stopped, of being questioned, not by a system, but by a man who carried the system's authority without its understanding. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. Far from it. But this one was different. This one had witnesses. This one had cameras. This one had implications. The memory of Nolan's voice, sharp, demanding, assuming, still rang in his ears. Not because it shocked him, but because it didn't. He had grown up hearing those tones, those judgments. Even in college, even in law school, there had always been someone asking him to explain his presence, to justify his success. And today had been no different. At the next red light, the agent in the passenger seat turned slightly and said, "You want us to file something?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "Not now," he replied. "Let them show their hand first." It wasn't bitterness in his voice. It was strategy. Elijah had learned that battles weren't always won in the moment. Sometimes, they were won in the silence afterward, when everyone thought the storm had passed. The SUV turned down a secure street, approaching a checkpoint where more agents waited. IDs were flashed, nods exchanged, and the gate lifted smoothly. As they pulled into the underground garage of the federal building, Elijah straightened his cuffs and exhaled deeply, preparing himself for the rest of the day. But no matter how important the work ahead was, part of him remained back on that sidewalk, standing in the shadow of a man who couldn't see past the suit to recognize who stood inside it. Back at the precinct, Nolan sat in the break room, sipping now-cold coffee, trying to avoid eye contact with the two younger officers who had seen the video. Because by then, of course, it had spread. What began as a few curious bystanders filming on their phones had become a viral firestorm. The clip showed everything, from Nolan's initial stop to Elijah's calm refusal to submit to baseless questioning, to the arrival of the black SUV and the agents addressing him as Mr. Brooks. The part that struck most viewers wasn't just the unfolding of events. It was the tone. Nolan's voice, sharp and accusatory. Elijah's, steady and unshaken. It was the stark contrast that made the video so hard to forget. Nolan scrolled through the comments under one of the re-uploads and saw a wave of public outrage. "This is what being black in America still looks like," one comment read. "Even in a suit. Even in DC." Another simply said, "He kept his dignity. The officer lost his." Despite his instinct to defend himself, Nolan couldn't ignore what the camera had captured. It was all there. The assumptions, the escalation, the lack of cause. He had let his bias walk ahead of his judgment. And worse still, he had done it so publicly. When his supervisor called him into the office, Nolan already knew what was coming. The conversation was brief, professional, and damning. "You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately," the captain said, sliding a thin envelope across the desk. "Until we finish the internal review." Nolan wanted to argue. He wanted to say he was just doing his job. But even he couldn't believe that anymore. So he nodded, picked up the envelope, and left in silence. His badge felt heavier than it had that morning. Across town, Elijah was walking into the west wing of the building, flanked by the agents who had picked him up earlier. Colleagues nodded respectfully as he passed, some unaware of what had happened, others fully in the loop. But no one said a word. They knew Elijah wasn't the kind to make a scene or seek sympathy. He didn't need a podium to command attention. He carried his authority the way some men carry faith, with quiet certainty. And as he stepped into the Situation Room, a space reserved for only the highest-level national matters, he let go of the morning's encounter. Not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. When Elijah stepped out of the SUV and into the private lower entrance of the National Security Complex, he was already dialing. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, not out of urgency, but habit, the kind of muscle memory built from years of precision under pressure. The call connected before the first full ring. "Brooks," came the voice on the other end, crisp and alert. Elijah responded in the same controlled tone. "There's going to be footage. I'm sure it's already out. Prep the press liaison and alert the chief of staff. I don't want this spiraling into something we can't control." The voice didn't ask questions. It simply said, "Understood." Before the line went dead, Elijah slipped the phone back into his inner jacket pocket and paused for a moment beneath the cold fluorescent lights of the underground corridor. His reflection flickered in the steel of the elevator doors ahead of him. To anyone else, he might have looked perfectly composed. But inside, something was stirring. Not panic, not anger, something older, deeper. A feeling that he had tried for years to rise above but which never let him forget where he came from. The elevator opened, and two junior intelligence aides stepped back instinctively as he entered. They knew who he was. Everyone in this building did. Elijah Brooks wasn't just another advisor. He was the man behind closed-door strategies, the architect of counter-espionage briefings, the one the president trusted enough to walk unannounced into the Oval Office. But none of that had mattered this morning when a badge and a gun blocked his path, demanding justification for his existence. He said nothing to the aides. They said nothing to him. The elevator rose in silence. At the top floor, the doors slid open to reveal a hallway lined with portraits of figures who had shaped the nation's security history. Elijah walked past them quickly, arriving at a heavy double door with a digital scanner. He placed his palm flat against the screen. The doors unlocked with a soft click, and he stepped into the Situation Room. Inside, a team of national advisors, analysts, and top-level military strategists turned as he entered. The president wasn't in the room yet, but his chief of staff, Marion Blake, was already reviewing files at the far end of the table. She looked up and met Elijah's gaze. Her face tightened. "I saw the footage," she said quietly as he reached for the chair beside her. Elijah set his briefcase down and opened it. "It's going to be loud," he replied without looking at her. "We need to control the narrative." Marion leaned in. "They'll crucify that cop." Elijah nodded slightly. "That's not my concern. My concern is that it doesn't become about me. If it becomes about me, we lose the momentum for the bigger conversation. This has to be about the pattern, not the person." Marion studied him for a moment. "You always did think 3 moves ahead," she said. He looked at her then, his eyes steady. "Because I was trained to. Survival isn't about reacting. It's about anticipating." Before Marion could respond, a staffer entered quickly. "Mr. President is en route," he said, and everyone in the room sat straighter. Elijah adjusted his cuffs. The briefing they were about to conduct concerned a cyber threat with potential global implications, but Elijah's mind hadn't left the street corner that morning. Not entirely. He didn't have the luxury to compartmentalize like others did. The things that happened to him out there had a way of bleeding into the decisions he made in here, and in a strange way that gave him clarity. Not weakness, strength. Meanwhile, in a modest one-story home in southeast D.C., a woman in her 60s sat at her kitchen table watching the news. Her name was Ruth Brooks, and she hadn't missed a single press conference or headline involving her son since the day he had joined the national security team. But this was different. This wasn't about policy or foreign threats. This was about him, her son, the child she had raised on her own while cleaning houses during the day and studying nursing at night. She had always told him, "Make them see you for your mind, not just your skin." And now, watching the video of a police officer stopping her son with suspicion thick in his voice, her hands trembled slightly over her teacup. Not because she was afraid. She had lived through worse. No, this time it was because she knew how close the past still sat, even in the shadow of progress. Back at the White House, Elijah stood as the president entered. The room fell silent as the leader of the free world took his seat, nodding once toward Elijah with familiarity. "Let's begin," the president said. And Elijah did, delivering a measured, thorough analysis of the cyber intelligence findings, mapping out next steps with the confidence and precision he had always carried. No one interrupted him. No one questioned his presence. In this room, his expertise wasn't just respected, it was vital. Yet not a single person who sat around that table had any idea that just 3 hours earlier, this same man had been treated like a suspect on the street. Elijah didn't bring it up. He didn't need to. The story was already out there, told in millions of pixels and replayed across networks. His focus remained here, because for all the noise that would follow, this was where real decisions were made. When the meeting adjourned, the president called Elijah aside briefly. They spoke in low tones, faces unreadable to the room. Then Elijah turned and walked out, briefcase in hand, his expression composed. But inside, the call he'd made earlier echoed louder now. The storm was coming. He hadn't asked for it, but he was ready. The moment the black SUV rounded the corner earlier that morning, cutting a clean, deliberate path through the gray noise of city traffic, it had seemed to emerge not just from another street, but from another world. The hum of its engine was deep and assertive, not loud but commanding, the way certain voices carry weight without needing to shout. The vehicle moved with intent, Not the rushed chaos of a siren-blaring squad car, but the cool, quiet confidence of presence. Officer Nolan had barely registered what was happening at first. His instincts told him something was off, but it wasn't until the SUV slowed, paused, and stopped within feet of where he stood that his hand inched instinctively toward his holster, only to freeze in midair. His pulse quickened, not because he felt threatened but because something about the moment was unraveling fast and far outside his control. Then the doors opened, first the front passenger side, then the rear, and the men who stepped out weren't local, weren't plainclothes detectives, and certainly weren't there by accident. Black suits, mirror-polished shoes, communication earpieces barely visible under trimmed hair. They didn't need to flash badges. Their very presence screamed federal. Secret Service. Nolan's breath hitched. His voice caught somewhere between a greeting and an apology that hadn't yet formed. One of the agents moved immediately toward Elijah, who remained perfectly still, his posture as upright and undisturbed as if this were all choreographed. "Mr. Brooks," the agent said, "we're here to escort you." That single sentence shattered every assumption Nolan had built in the last 5 minutes. His eyes darted from Elijah's face to the emblem now clearly visible on the briefcase clasp the man carried. The gold circle gleamed in the morning light, and though Nolan couldn't see every detail, he saw enough. An eagle, an olive branch, a cluster of stars. The presidential seal. It was one of those moments where time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Nolan's mouth opened but nothing came out. He saw himself suddenly and painfully clearly, not as an authority figure but as a man who had acted out of assumption and ego, who had misjudged and mishandled a situation not because of protocol, but because of pride. The agents didn't look at him. Not really. One gave a curt nod, the kind that dismissed more than it acknowledged, before returning to the SUV. Elijah followed, pausing only once to glance briefly back at Nolan. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even cold. It was a look of such silent disappointment that Nolan found it more cutting than if the man had screamed in his face. And then the door closed with a soft thud. The SUV eased back into traffic, and the moment was over, but not gone. Around them, the murmurs had already begun. People who had stopped on the sidewalks now whispered, pointing toward Nolan, toward the space where Elijah had stood only moments earlier. Several had filmed the entire interaction, and though none of them said a word to the officer, their expressions spoke volumes. Nolan stood there, a uniformed man suddenly stripped bare of any authority, now forced to reckon with the knowledge that his actions would not stay private, that they had already begun to take on a life of their own in the form of video clips, social media posts, and whispered phone calls. By the time he returned to his cruiser, his hands were shaking, not from fear of discipline, but from the jarring realization that he had seen power and had failed to recognize it. Not because it wasn't displayed, but because it didn't fit the image he expected. Inside the SUV, Elijah settled into the back seat without a word. The silence in the vehicle was not awkward but deliberate, professional. The agents didn't ask if he was all right. They didn't need to. One of them handed him a small secured tablet. Elijah glanced at the screen, an overview of briefing updates for the national security meeting ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't immediately dive into the data. He looked instead at his reflection in the tinted glass. What the officer had seen, what the public would soon see, was only part of the story. The rest, the years of work, the endless tests of competence, the quiet victories and silent endurance, none of that had fit in the frame of a phone camera. But Elijah knew it was there, and he knew that eventually the world would have to face it. As the SUV made its final turn into the restricted federal entrance, one of the agents spoke softly. "Mr. Brooks, we've been informed the press has already picked up the clip. It's on 3 major networks." Elijah nodded. "Expected. Let them run with it. We'll respond later, our way." The SUV descended into the parking structure's secure level, lights flickering off its glossy finish as it moved past security checkpoints. The hum of concrete and echoing footsteps gave way to silence again as Elijah stepped out. His briefcase was still in hand, the seal still visible, and his steps were as firm and measured as they had been before the interruption. Because no matter what had happened on that sidewalk, no matter who had tried to belittle him, Elijah Brooks knew exactly who he was. And now the whole world would know too. The room had emptied, the walls echoing faintly with the last footsteps of aides and analysts retreating into the rhythm of another national security cycle. But Elijah remained seated, still as stone in the tall-backed leather chair at the head of the polished oak table. His fingers gently rested on the briefcase in front of him, its dark leather unmarred, except for the gleaming emblem pressed subtly into its surface, the presidential seal. It wasn't ostentatious. It wasn't meant to be. But it spoke with quiet authority, with legacy, with earned trust. That seal had not been given lightly. It was a mark not of fame, but of burden. A symbol of how far he had come, and the miles he had traveled from the streets of Atlanta where he was raised to the highest inner circles of national power. It was ironic, he thought, that the very thing meant to protect the Republic could not protect him from suspicion on a public sidewalk. Not even that seal could make him invisible to the reflex of prejudice. He reached down and opened the case not for dramatic effect, but because inside it was the next chapter of work, the next challenge, the next decision. The room may have grown silent, but the weight of duty was never lifted. As his eyes scanned the briefing notes, his mind wandered, not in distraction but in layered thought. He remembered the first time he had seen that seal, on the wall behind the podium during his initial White House clearance interview. Back then it had felt distant, ceremonial. But now it lived with him, on documents, in conversations, and on the leather case he carried each morning. He remembered his father's voice, gravelly and tired from decades of factory work, telling him, "One day, you'll walk into rooms they never imagined you belonged in. But when you do, stand like you were always meant to be there." And that was what Elijah had done every day since. Yet this morning had shaken even his deepest calm. Not because it was new, but because it was not. It was old, familiar, exhausting, a reminder that even the highest seals and most sacred trusts could not erase what the world chose to see first. The seal did not matter to Officer Nolan. The suit, the stride, the silence. All had made Elijah suspicious in the man's eyes. It didn't matter that he was headed to brief the President of the United States on intelligence threats no civilian would ever know existed. In that officer's gaze, he had simply been another man to question. That, more than anything, was what carved the ache into his chest. Not rage, not helplessness, just weary familiarity. The door creaked open softly, and Marion Blake stepped in. She had known Elijah for nearly a decade, long before the world knew his name. She carried a tablet and a quiet concern across her expression. "The President wants you in the Oval Office in 20, she said gently. Elijah nodded. "Any word from press?" Marion hesitated. "It's all over now. Trending. A few outlets are painting it clean. Others are questioning the officer's conduct. But the internet, that's where the fire's burning." Elijah closed the briefcase and stood. "Let them burn," he said quietly, not with vengeance, but with certainty. "Let them see the truth in flames if that's what it takes." Marion looked at him and said, "You know what's coming, right?" Elijah gave a small nod. "They're going to spin this, politicize it, divide people with it. But it's not about me. It never was. It's about the fact that a black man in a suit, with that seal in his hand, still has to prove he belongs." Marion's voice softened. "You proved it already. Every day." Elijah's gaze remained firm. "Then it's time we remind them." They walked down the corridor in silence. As they passed by portraits of advisors long gone and presidents whose legacies had been carved into history, Elijah paused in front of one, the image of a man with eyes as sharp as his jaw, the first black president. He had met him once, briefly. He had shaken his hand, looked into his eyes, and seen both pride and pain. Elijah stared at the portrait and said, almost to himself, "He opened the door. We just have to keep walking through it." Marion didn't speak. She didn't have to. By the time Elijah stepped into the Oval Office, the president was already standing by the windows, hands clasped behind his back, eyes trained on the rose garden. He turned as Elijah entered and offered a small, knowing smile. "Rough morning?" he asked. Elijah didn't return the smile. "Eventful," he replied. The president gestured to a chair. "Sit. Let's talk." What followed wasn't a political meeting. It wasn't a security briefing. It was two men speaking plainly. One entrusted with the most powerful office in the world, the other entrusted with its most sensitive truths. They didn't need formality. They needed honesty, and Elijah gave it. He explained what happened on that street, not with outrage, but with clarity. The president listened, and when it was done, he didn't offer pity or platitudes. He said, "We'll handle this the right way, but more than that, we'll make sure they see you. Not just in this building, but out there, on their screens, in their living rooms. We'll make sure they see who you are." Elijah rose from the chair, briefcase in hand, and nodded once. "Then let's begin." By midday, the video had exploded across every major platform. What had started as a shaky cell phone recording, less than 3 minutes long, captured by a curious bystander on a city sidewalk, had now been reshared millions of times. It didn't need commentary or editing. The footage spoke for itself. It showed a sharply dressed black man being confronted by a white police officer who, without provocation, questioned his right to simply walk down the street. And then, in a single stunning twist, it showed that same man being addressed as Mr. Brooks by two federal agents and stepping into a black SUV that bore diplomatic clearance. But what made the video viral wasn't just the revelation of power. It was the contrast, the tension between assumption and reality, the way the officer's tone shifted, the way his confidence crumbled the moment he realized who he was dealing with. It was the kind of clip that made people pause mid-scroll and watch again, not just because it was dramatic, but because it was all too familiar. Within hours, every major news outlet had picked it up. Headlines ranged from diplomatic to incendiary. Senior White House advisor mistakenly detained by police officer read one. Another was more blunt. Black man in a suit harassed until he flashed presidential seal. The most viral headline came from a grassroots social justice blog that simply read, "Still not enough." The video became a mirror for the nation, and what it reflected stirred uncomfortable truths. Cable news anchors dissected the footage frame by frame. Talk radio buzzed with opinion. Commentators debated the role of race, power, and the invisible lines that still divide America's streets. Hashtags began trending, hashtag walking while black, hashtag Elijah Brooks, hashtag presidential seal, and alongside them came a flood of reactions. Celebrities tweeted their outrage. Activists called for deeper accountability. Public officials offered carefully worded statements. But for every voice of support, there were others critical, skeptical, dismissive. "Why didn't he just show his ID?" some asked, ignoring the bigger picture. "This is why you respect police authority," others argued, missing the fact that authority without respect is only fear in disguise. And yet, amidst the noise, one voice began to rise above the others. Not Elijah's, but his mother's. Ruth Brooks had always stayed quiet in the background of her son's life, proud but private. That morning, however, she had watched the clip on her tablet, tears in her eyes not from surprise, but from recognition. She had seen this play out in smaller ways all her life, in grocery stores, in waiting rooms, in bank lines. Moments when her presence was questioned, when her dignity was overlooked. And now, the same eyes that once watched her son walk into his first day of kindergarten in a borrowed blazer were watching him endure something she had hoped he might never have to. But Ruth, though soft-spoken, was never passive. That afternoon, when a local journalist called her for comment, she didn't hesitate. "My son didn't get where he is by being angry," she said calmly. "He got there by being excellent. And no amount of suspicion can erase that." The quote was shared thousands of times. People were moved by her grace, her quiet power. And through her, the world began to see Elijah not just as a symbol, but as a son. Back in D.C., Elijah sat in his office, the blinds partially drawn against the soft glare of the setting sun. His phone buzzed nonstop, calls from friends, texts from colleagues, emails from strangers who wanted to say they were sorry, or grateful, or inspired. But he didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. His focus remained on the work, on the briefing notes spread before him, on the next step. He wasn't avoiding the spotlight. He simply didn't need it. He knew the cameras would come. He knew there would be pressure to speak, to make a statement, to become a voice for yet another public reckoning. And he was willing, but only on his own terms. A soft knock came at the door, and Marion stepped in again. "Press office is asking for your decision," she said. Elijah looked up. "Not yet," he replied. "Let it breathe." She nodded, understanding. They had been through this kind of moment before. Different names, different faces, same headlines. But this time it wasn't abstract. It was him. Later that evening, a clip surfaced that hadn't been seen yet. Shot from a second angle, it captured the exact moment Elijah pulled out his phone, the calm authority in his voice as he said, "This is Brooks. I'm being delayed at the perimeter. Can you confirm with the gate?" There was no aggression, no panic, just control. The clip spread like wildfire. People dissected his poise, his composure, the way he never raised his voice even when threatened. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. It wasn't just a story about racial profiling anymore. It was a story about dignity under pressure, about professionalism in the face of insult, about power that doesn't need to announce itself. The next morning, as the sun rose over Washington, a mural began to appear on the side of a building in southeast D.C. It showed Elijah in his suit, briefcase in hand, eyes forward. Behind him, the presidential seal faintly glowed, not as a badge of power, but as a quiet assertion of presence. Beneath the image were just 3 words, painted in gold. He belonged here. No artist claimed it. No one took credit. But the city knew. And across the country, in classrooms and courtrooms and quiet conversations at kitchen tables, people began to talk. Not just about what happened to Elijah Brooks, but about why it still happens. The video was still playing. But the message had already been received. As the public storm raged on outside, across newsrooms, social media, coffee shops, and dinner tables, inside the Metropolitan Police Department, another kind of storm was quietly brewing, one that didn't rely on hashtags or headlines, but on memos, formal reports, and closed-door conversations. Officer Nolan sat at a steel table in an unadorned interview room on the 3rd floor of Internal Affairs, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights pressing down on his thoughts. He wasn't in handcuffs. He hadn't been arrested. But the weight he carried now was far heavier than any physical restraint. On the opposite side of the table sat a pair of investigators, both calm, unreadable, and efficient. Their voices were measured, their questions clinical, but every syllable chipped away at the thin armor of denial Nolan had worn since the incident. They began by asking him to recount the event in his own words. He spoke slowly, choosing phrases that sounded procedural, almost rehearsed: standard patrol, suspicious behavior, non-compliance. But when one of the investigators interrupted to play back the viral clip on a government-issued tablet, the sterile language began to falter. Nolan watched himself on the screen. Posture puffed up with self-importance, voice edged with unnecessary force, eyes narrowing not out of caution, but of assumption. He saw the moment Elijah identified himself, the moment the agents arrived, the moment his own confidence broke like glass on pavement. The investigator paused the clip and asked, "At what point did you consider de-escalating the situation?" Nolan shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't realize who he was," he muttered. The response hung in the air like a confession. The second investigator didn't blink. Should that have mattered? Downstairs, in a separate conference room, Chief Reynolds sat with members of the mayor's office and the police oversight committee. A stack of folders sat in front of him: complaints, training records, public statements, press briefings. The pressure was mounting from every direction. Protesters had gathered outside headquarters for 2 days straight. Civic leaders were calling for swift action. City council members demanded transparency. And yet, what made the situation most volatile wasn't just the video or the backlash. It was who Elijah Brooks was. This wasn't a routine misconduct case. This was national. And if the department didn't handle it with care and clarity, it wouldn't just be a local scandal. It would be a stain on the entire city. Chief Reynolds wasn't a man prone to dramatics. He was a 30-year veteran, hardened by time and politics, and he knew how these fires burned. But even he could feel the temperature rising beyond the usual. He opened one of the folders and glanced again at Nolan's personnel file. A few minor reprimands, nothing that raised red flags at the time. But now, in the shadow of this incident, even the smallest missteps took on new weight. A pattern, however faint, began to emerge. A history of overreach, a tendency to escalate, an attitude that had gone unchecked for too long. Back in the interview room, the investigators pressed forward. Do you understand why this case is being reviewed at the federal level? Nolan looked up, eyes rimmed with fatigue. I made a mistake, he said finally, his voice smaller than before. But it wasn't about race. One of the investigators raised an eyebrow. Then what was it about? Silence followed. Nolan had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer he couldn't say out loud. That somewhere, deep down, he had seen a black man in a sharp suit on a quiet street and had assumed he didn't belong. No criminal record. No evidence. Just a hunch. And now that hunch had cost him more than he had yet begun to realize. That afternoon, the department issued a formal statement. Officer Nolan had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal investigation. The statement was short, cautious, and carefully worded. But outside the walls of the precinct, it landed like a thunderclap. Demonstrators outside City Hall cheered. Civil rights leaders called it a necessary first step. Elijah, for his part, remained silent. He had released no statement, granted no interviews, and posted nothing on social media. He hadn't needed to. The country was speaking for him now. But behind the scenes, there were deeper moves underway. The Office of the Inspector General had launched a review into police conduct across the district. Training procedures were being reevaluated. Supervisors were being interviewed about what kind of culture had been allowed to grow beneath their watch. A memo from the Department of Justice requested access to all bodycam footage related to the incident. Not just the clip that went viral, but the minutes before and after. Trust, once taken for granted, was now a subject of forensic examination. Late that evening, Nolan sat alone in his apartment, the soft buzz of his phone reminding him of everything he'd lost. Friends had gone quiet. Fellow officers offered only terse replies. His wife had taken the kids to her sister's house, just for a few days. And as he stared at the muted news broadcast flashing images of Elijah Brooks, the black SUV, the presidential seal, and his own face now etched into the national debate, he realized the truth wasn't just that he had judged someone wrongly. It was that the world had finally judged him back. And this time, the camera had been pointed at him. For 6 days, Elijah Brooks said nothing. Not because he lacked words, but because he knew the weight they carried. In his world, silence wasn't absence, it was strategy. And in the eye of the nation's media storm, his silence became its own kind of message, drawing attention, speculation, and even admiration. Commentators debated it, public figures called for it to end, and networks filled the void with every possible opinion. But Elijah waited. He waited through the interviews, the protests, the petitions demanding change, through the hashtags that climbed the trending lists and the late-night hosts who praised his composure. He waited through private calls from senators and quiet messages from those who once questioned his role but now scrambled to be on the right side of history. And only when the noise reached a pitch that even the walls of the West Wing could no longer hold back did he decide the time had come to speak. Not to defend himself, but to redirect the conversation entirely. It was a Sunday evening when the press office released the announcement. Elijah Brooks would be delivering a public statement from the East Room of the White House the next day, not on behalf of the administration, but in his own capacity. The wording was deliberate. This would not be political spin. It would be personal truth. The announcement alone was enough to stop broadcasts mid-sentence. Newsrooms shifted into high gear. Headlines flared. People rearranged meetings. Churches ended services early. Teachers planned their Monday lessons around the live feed. There was a sense, almost unspoken, that something larger was about to unfold. Not a press release, not a reaction, but a reckoning. When the morning arrived, the East Room filled with a silence far different than the usual ceremonial hush. This was the kind of silence that comes before storms or revelations. At exactly 10 o'clock, Elijah stepped up to the podium, alone. No one flanked him. No aides stood behind him. He wore the same dark suit from the now famous video, tailored, sharp, unbothered. The presidential seal glinted from the front of the lectern, but it was not what drew the room's attention. It was his eyes, calm, focused, aware of everything and everyone. He paused, let the quiet settle like snow, then spoke. "I wasn't going to speak," he began, voice low but clear. "Not because I was afraid, and not because I didn't care, but because I wanted the silence to reveal what noise often hides." He looked around the room briefly. On that morning, a man with a badge looked at me and decided I didn't belong. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't ask who I was. He made a decision. And that decision wasn't based on behavior or threat or reason. It was based on something much older. Something baked into the American pavement long before either of us was born. He let that sink in, then continued, each word as deliberate as the steps he took every day into rooms where few like him had ever stood. "This isn't about me. It's not about a badge or a title or a seal on a briefcase. It's about the millions of moments that never make the news." The students stopped on their way to class. The fathers questioned outside their own homes. The professionals asked to prove their credentials again and again and again. It's about dignity, about the right to move through this country without suspicion dragging at your heels. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room leaned in, held tight by the power of restraint, of resolve. Some have said I handled myself with grace. Others have said I should have demanded justice. But I didn't act out of grace. I acted out of experience. Because I've been here before. Not this exact street, not this exact badge, but this exact moment. And like so many others, I learned long ago that sometimes survival depends on your ability to stay composed while your very identity is being questioned. The cameras didn't blink. Neither did the audience. Elijah took a breath, then offered a shift. "But let me be clear, this is not a condemnation. This is a call. A call to see more. A call to train better. A call to expect more from those who swear to protect. Because trust doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from understanding. And authority is not diminished by humility. It's strengthened by it." He closed with something that hadn't been in any of the rehearsals. Not with the press team, not with Marion, not even with the president. It was a line from his mother. "My mother once told me, make them see your mind, not just your skin. I have spent my entire life doing just that. But maybe now, finally, it's time the country does the same." There was no applause. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because no one wanted to break the moment. For several long seconds, the room remained frozen. The weight of his words suspended in the air like dust in sunlight. And then, slowly, the reality settled in. He had not just spoken. He had shifted the narrative. He had taken the spotlight thrust upon him and turned it outward, forcing the country to look at itself, not through outrage but through clarity. As Elijah stepped away from the podium, reporters shouted questions he didn't stop to answer. He had said what needed to be said. Anything more would only dilute it. He passed down the hallway quietly, the echo of his footsteps disappearing behind him. But the echo of his message, of that voice, that statement, would not fade anytime soon. The press conference was announced with little warning, just a single-line bulletin issued from the Metropolitan Police Department late Thursday afternoon. Officer James Nolan will issue a public statement regarding the recent incident involving Mr. Elijah Brooks. There were no details beyond that. No location given until hours before. No indication of whether this was a personal choice or one made under institutional pressure. But by the time the appointed hour arrived, reporters were packed shoulder to shoulder outside the precinct's community briefing hall. Cameras mounted, mics live, every outlet waiting with the kind of nervous anticipation usually reserved for political upsets or court verdicts. The podium was modest, with the department's emblem printed on the backdrop and a single American flag draped to one side. And when Officer Nolan finally stepped into view, it was clear to all that this would not be business as usual. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a plain navy blue shirt, sleeves rolled up, the lines beneath his eyes more visible than usual, like a man who had aged years in a matter of days. He didn't walk with the rigid posture of law enforcement protocol. He walked like someone carrying the full weight of consequence. As he approached the mic, he didn't wait for silence. He didn't glance down at notes. He simply looked into the sea of lenses and said, in a voice more human than anyone expected, "My name is James Nolan. I am a police officer, and I owe the people of this city, and especially Mr. Elijah Brooks, a sincere and public apology." He paused, swallowed, and continued. On the morning of June 17th, I encountered Mr. Brooks on a public sidewalk and, based solely on my perception and not on any evidence or behavior, I chose to stop and question him. I did so with an assumption that was mine alone, an assumption rooted in bias. That bias, conscious or not, led me to misjudge a man whose only suspicious behavior was walking to work while wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. There was no shifting of blame, no bureaucratic language to cushion the edges of responsibility. He didn't say he was following protocol. He didn't say he feared for his safety. He said what the country had already seen on the footage, and what so many others had experienced in silence for generations. "I've served in law enforcement for over 16 years, Nolan went on. "I've taken oaths to protect, to serve, to uphold justice. And yet, in that moment, I failed those very principles. I saw a black man in a place I didn't expect him to be, and I assumed the worst. That assumption didn't come from training. It didn't come from evidence. It came from something deeper, something I now know must be unlearned." He gripped the edges of the podium for a moment, eyes scanning the audience, not looking for sympathy, but trying, it seemed, to stay upright beneath the burden of truth. Mr. Brooks showed me restraint I didn't deserve, dignity I failed to offer, and a kind of calm that should never be expected of someone in his position. When the federal agents arrived, I realized the mistake not just in rank or authority, but in the very lens through which I had seen him. It was a lens I didn't know I wore, and for that ignorance, I am deeply ashamed. There was a stir in the audience, not of outrage, but of stunned attention. This was not the sort of apology the public had grown used to. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't rehearsed spin. It was something rarer. Accountability stripped of ego. "I have since been placed on leave," he said plainly, "and I welcome the investigation. Whatever consequences arise, I will accept them. Because true justice does not end at punishment. It begins with honesty. And this is mine, I failed. Not just Mr. Brooks, but everyone who has ever been treated with suspicion instead of respect. For every father, son, colleague, or neighbor who has been stopped without cause. I see you now, and I am sorry." At the back of the room, reporters didn't interrupt. They didn't shout follow-ups. They let the silence sit, thick with the history behind his words. Nolan took one final breath and added, "This isn't the end of the conversation. Shouldn't be. But if my failure can become a small step toward change, toward humility, then I ask that it be used for something better than outrage. I ask that it be used for growth." He stepped away from the podium without shaking hands or offering smiles. He didn't wait for applause. There was none. He exited through a side door, disappearing from view, not into obscurity, but into the long, slow road of atonement. Outside, reactions were immediate. Some called it too little, too late. Others said it was the most honest thing they'd heard from an officer in years. On the evening news, one analyst remarked that Nolan's words wouldn't erase what happened, but they might begin to rebuild something fragile: trust. That night, Elijah sat in his home office, lights low, the city humming softly beyond the windows. He had watched the press conference live but said nothing. Only when Marion called to ask what he thought did he finally answer, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "He didn't speak like a man trying to save his job," Elijah said. "He spoke like a man who finally saw the mirror." Marion exhaled on the other end. "So, what happens next?" There was a pause. Then Elijah replied, "Now we find out if the country saw it too." The following Monday morning, the sun broke gently over Washington, casting a golden wash across the marble of the Capitol and soft shadows along the sidewalks where commuters began their routines once more. The city moved with its usual rhythm. Cars inching along avenues, baristas pouring lattes for suited professionals, cyclists weaving through crosswalks. But beneath that rhythm, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't seismic. It didn't roar. But it was real, and it lived in the way people looked at one another, in the moments of pause before judgment, in the flicker of self-awareness that hadn't been there just 2 weeks before. In the heart of this quiet change walked Elijah Brooks, his pace steady, briefcase in hand, the soles of his shoes tapping evenly against the sidewalk he now claimed not just as his right, but as a symbol. He took the same route as always, not because he had to, but because he chose to. There had been suggestions, of course, security offers, alternative entrances, underground parking, but Elijah declined them all. "If I change my walk," he told Marion, "then the wrong person won." And so he walked, past the same iron fences, past the same storefronts, past the corner where it all began. The street felt different now, not in its bricks or traffic, but in its meaning. That sidewalk was no longer just a path to work. It was a place where truth had collided with assumption and where the world had been made to look, really look at what it meant to belong. As he approached the security gate, the same guard from the incident stood posted. Their eyes met briefly, a nod passed between them. Not stiff or rehearsed, but real. And Elijah didn't need an apology. He needed only acknowledgement. That moment of silent recognition was more powerful than 1,000 words. Inside the West Wing, aides and colleagues greeted him not with pity or awkward glances, but with quiet respect, the kind that comes not from fear or awe, but from watching someone carry themselves through fire without burning others in the process. In the days since his statement, messages had poured in from across the country. Veterans, pastors, teachers, college students, even retired police officers had written to him. Some letters shared stories of their own unjust experiences. Others offered gratitude, and a few, the ones Elijah read most carefully, admitted hard truths. "I didn't see it before," one read, "but now I do, because of you." Those words didn't erase what had happened, but they pointed to something deeper, a shift in perception, a crack in the armor of denial that had long protected comfort over confrontation. Even within the Metropolitan Police Department, quiet reforms had begun. New training modules were being developed. Dialogue circles were piloted with officers and civilians alike. The chief had announced the formation of an independent civilian review board. These weren't sweeping legislative reforms, not yet, but they were seeds that might grow into something lasting if nurtured with integrity. And Elijah, while not leading these changes directly, had become their quiet catalyst. Not by campaigning, but by existing, by walking, by refusing to disappear. That evening, Elijah stood on the rooftop terrace of his building, the city unfolding before him in glowing grids and shimmering towers. Marion joined him, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and a folded newspaper. She handed him the front page. There, beside a photo of him walking calmly toward the White House gates, was the headline, "A Different Kind of Power." Elijah read it, said nothing, then smiled faintly. "It's a start," he murmured. Marion nodded. "You think they'll remember this in 6 months?" He turned toward her, eyes thoughtful. "Some will forget. Most always do. But a few won't. And those few, they'll make sure the rest remember again." Below them, a group of high school students walked past the building, laughing and animated, unaware of who stood above them or what had unfolded on that very street not long ago. And that was how it should be, not because the story didn't matter, but because the future didn't need to carry the same weight if the present carried it well. Elijah raised his glass slightly toward the horizon and said quietly, "We keep walking, no matter how many times they make us stop." And with that, the night deepened. But it did not darken, because in the stillness that followed, in the city that now bore the echoes of a changed conversation, in the hearts of people who had looked away for too long but now dared to face the truth, there was light. Not blinding, not instant, but light nonetheless. And sometimes all it takes to move a nation forward is for one man to walk without fear, and for others to finally see why he had to. And so, as Elijah Brooks walked forward, not just for himself, but for all those who had ever been stopped, silenced, or unseen, we are reminded that real change doesn't always begin with protests or policies. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet, dignified walk, and the courage to keep going when the world says you don't belong. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, for listening all the way through, and for holding space for stories that matter. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect even a little, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you, or if you've ever experienced something similar. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And together, when we listen, we grow. See you in the next story. Until then, take care and keep walking forward.